Welcome, everyone, to episode 1 of the Ready or Not podcast with Scott D. Woods. I'm Scott Woods, Vice President for Community Engagement and Strategic Partnerships with Ready.net, and it is my pleasure to be here with you today. I'm also a former senior staffer and the inaugural director of the Office of Minority Broadband Initiatives at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, or NTIA. In this show, we'll highlight the people and the organizations who are putting in the work to close the digital divide in local communities. And we'll talk to community leaders, local service providers, government representatives, and national advocates. You'll hear the perspectives and opinions from those who do the work of connecting the unserved and the underserved, those who are building the networks and implementing digital equity programs to ensure everyone can participate in the modern digital economy of our country. But our podcast will also have a lighter side. My guests will share their personal insights, their journeys, their stories, their work, and we'll keep things relatively fun and informal. So today, my special guest is Joshua Edmonds, the Director of Digital Inclusion for my hometown, the city of Detroit, Michigan. Josh, welcome to the show.
Yep. So Joshua Edmonds, I'm the Director of Digital Inclusion for the city of Detroit. Was not always the Director of Digital Inclusion, obviously. And I know that we've talked offline in other instances. I'm originally from Cleveland, Ohio, so I'm not from Detroit. However, I love and support the city as much as I can, even over my own hometown. But that being said, again, from Cleveland, Ohio, I really got involved in this digital inclusion work. Actually, after grad school, I went to Howard University for graduate school, and I did a stint in Denver, Colorado, working for a senator and aquaponics. I was just kind of doing things to kind of see what made the most sense. But when I went back to Cleveland after grad school, I worked on President Obama's Connect Home initiative. So specifically working in public housing, figuring out, not only did we do some line of sight deployments, but we also set up computer labs, we did hackathons, we did pretty much everything we could think of. One of the big pieces we were working on at the time there was actually signing up people for low cost internet at the time. This was, some years ago, and that's still a strategy. But shortly after my time working in public housing, I moved over to working in philanthropy at the Cleveland Foundation, focusing on eradicating Northeast Ohio's digital divide and building coalition out there. And so when the opportunity was made available to work in city government at the time, and this was in 2018, at the time, you really didn't have city governments, especially in your large urban cores, creating positions that had legitimate authority on eradicating the digital divide. You had people who might have been coordinators, but to have a director level, senior level staffer focusing on eradicating the digital divide, that was new. And it made sense at the time to take that step into this journey and getting into looking at how a municipality would work in this. And so ever since then, I've been working here. I think that we're over 3.5 years now into the role, and it's been a joy. And I'm only saying that because I'm on this podcast that it's been a joy, but it's been many other things too.
Absolutely. So let's talk about that. So thus far, what have been some of your challenge, your obstacles, and most importantly, some wins that you can take credit for on behalf of the city of Detroit?
Yeah, so I'm going to lead with the challenges because there were and are many and will be many. There's definitely no sugarcoating there. When I first got to Detroit, no one knew me. No one knew Director of Digital Inclusion, what that even meant, what that did. Most people thought that was HR, diversity and inclusion. I just completely skipped over the digital part of it. So I had a brand issue I was working against because no one knew me. I also had a optics issue because optically no one even knew what this role meant. And then on the last part, I didn't have a budget and I didn't have a staff. So not a whole lot of reasons that were like shining examples to take this job, other than the fact that I legitimately believe that if you had someone who could wake up every single day and just care about this stuff, you had the opportunity to do some good. And so my very first year, again, that wasn't a pandemic during the time I could use to cosign the digital divide. It was just cold, hard facts. So it was knowing my data. I told people that I used to go to bed and on my nightstand, I had a picture of all the stats on Detroit's digital inequity. And I'd read it every night before I went to bed. And I'd wake up and I'd look at those things. It kept me in my mindset. I used to go do 1 or 3 community events minimum every single week, just so people get to know me. The first year's challenge, though, in 2019 was all on awareness. Yeah, people knew that there was some type of inequity, but yeah, it kind of got lost in the sauce with everything else. And then, honestly, 2020 hits. That presented its own set of challenges because, yeah, people see the pandemic, it cosigns the issue, but at the same time, when it cosigned the issue, what it did was it created this funneling effect of just everything now falling. All those words that you were saying before, well, now people are saying, well, how true is it? It's almost the equivalent of pressing print 30 times. And then one day you wake up and you have, a massive stack of paper. It's essentially what happened here where, all 2019, we need coalition, we need funders, we need this, we need this, we need this. And then 2020, people are like, well, fine, pandemic's here. What do we need again? And so all of those words that were said that, thankfully, the strategy was solid at the time. But ever since then, we've been focusing a lot on building a coalition, building a movement. It's called Connect 313. People can learn more at connect313.org. And that is something that I've been able to build in partnership with a few other great stakeholders like Microsoft, United Way, the Rocky Community Fund, and obviously the city. We've been able to build this brain trust that now has over 700 members, all committed to bridging Detroit's digital divide. We've been able to establish our own Connect 313 fund. We have support from the Rocket Mortgage Classic, which is on the PGA Tour. They will be supporting Connect 313 until 2027. We have a network of 21 different neighborhood technology hubs. We have a network of community ambassadors. We've been really able to turn the corner on our digital equity work and getting coordinated. But remember at the very beginning where all this started, no budget, no staff, and no one knowing. And then today we're standing on top of this movement. And quite frankly, as we see the federal funding that's going to be coming down specifically within the Digital Equity Act, we feel pretty good about our chances of securing some of that funding, which goes to one of our other pieces that if we have the ability to scale and grow and attract additional resources, there is sustainability in this work if we do it right.
Absolutely. That's impressive wins. Talk to me about those early days. So no budget, no staff, no support, right? New to the city, from Ohio, by the way. For those of you who don't know, I'm from Detroit, and it's two things Michiganders can't stand. One is Ohio, two is Ohio. So, right? So you're outsider. You're from Ohio. No budget, no staff, no support. What were those early days like for you?
So I'll tell you a bit of a funny story that kind of sets the tone here. What people don't know about Detroit if they've never visited, Detroit has very specific street names that are French inspired, but there's some vernacular that has added to their pronunciations. So I couldn't pronounce my streets here either.
You couldn't pronounce Livernois, like Liver Noir? What is that?
Wait till you hear how I was pronouncing Gratiot. I was saying Gradio the whole time. but even not knowing my street names, and I remember my first day in the mayor's cabinet, I told them that I was an Ohio State fan just because I was like joking, but people didn't think that was funny. They were actually upset with that. I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. But I think the early days, I look back fondly at them, but during the time I couldn't stand them. I couldn't stand them because it was just no's, just no, like over and over and over again of us trying to get philanthropic support, private sector support, and people like, yeah, we understand the words that you're saying, but that's not important in this issue over here. And the thing is with cities like a Detroit, there are no shortage of challenges. And so everyone is already kind of vying for at least some type of spotlight to get their thing resourced. And, it was very tough to compete with a number of other very pressing, if not more pressing priorities. And so a lot of my meetings were essentially me just almost begging even people who weren't the most respectful at times because I was an outsider. And so, rightful skepticism was thrown my way. And I kind of would just end those meetings with, hey, I know that you don't trust, or I know that you don't believe, or whatever it is, but at the end of the day, I got to work with you. I believe in this partnership. So one day it's going to yield fruit. And so unbeknownst to me, that those were seeds that were being planted, that now a lot of those people who were maybe not the most engaged with what we're doing are now some of the best partners we have today. I'll also admit that I did have to do some interesting ways to get support. So, I think I mentioned before, my name being Joshua goes a long way, especially in Detroit, where there are churches on almost every corner in these neighborhoods. And so when I'm going to these churches, I'm like, hi, I'm Joshua Edmonds. I said, what was that name again? Joshua? Oh, yeah. So that helped me a lot. And I also say that a lot of the community events, just even me getting familiar with learning how to hustle. For folks who don't know, hustling is a thing that Detroiters do. It is a
Absolutely.
dance, and it's like line dancing, but they have them for each specific song. They have their specific hustle. Learning how to do those. So a lot of the work in the earlier days. At the time I went into it, I thought it was about building a strategy, and it had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with community, and not in that fluffy, abstract sense. Legitimate community, legitimately living in these neighborhoods and legitimately seeing people and talking to them at the realest, lowest level that you can. That was my
Mhm.
experience all year one. And so now all of a sudden, when we have these conversations about commercials that we're in and all these other things, like that all stems from the very early work of me just having conversations at churches and picnics and on dance floors,
And,
shuffling
and
and hustling with people.
and I think this. Your experience has borne this out. The work in the community, the engagement piece, can't be overlooked. I mean, it's actually people don't won't work with you if they don't know who you are, know your character, know what you stand for. If you can't do the local dance, right? Like you can't between 6 Mile and 8 Mile, right? You can't go 250 feet without hitting the church. So if you don't know the differences in church culture, yeah, you're not going to make it. You're not going to make it in Detroit.
And the
So
irony of
bonsoir for the people who are phonetically challenged.
the irony of you saying between 6 and 8 mile, because I live on 7 mile. So you're absolutely right.
Well, let's jump right into it, right? So, and that's a great backstory. But as you know, recently the NTIA for the BEAD and Digital Equity Act programs NTIA announced that all 50 states, DC, and the territories all signed on. I know there aren't any surprises, but what stood out to you in this particular effort and endeavor where we are right now?
So, I will be honest. There were a few things that did. One, the data collection and the challenge process. We like that. I think I was primed when I saw this stuff happening. I'm like, oh, here we go. This is going to be another thing. But I said, okay, that's a silver lining. And I would say it's even more than a silver lining. It's actually a legitimate chance for our voice to be heard. And it puts the onus on local communities to organize. And so we're not sad about that. We like that approach. In addition to that, I think the sheer amount of capital that was surprising. I mean, we're talking about billions. Sometimes we've seen, especially with broadband funding, a big number gets articulated, and then it kind of gets filtered all the way down to a couple 100 million. But the fact that this was said to be all these billions and it stayed at all those billions, that surprised us. I also think that the amount of money that went towards the Affordable Connectivity Program really surprised us. I think I have mixed thoughts on it because I would have liked for that money to go towards a longer term solution, but at the same time, obviously the need is so great, and to have that level of leadership sign off that fast and get everybody on one accord, and then get the local community signing people up for this stuff, that's a beautiful thing. And
Mhm.
so I think that collectively, I'm looking optimistically at the current federal leadership we have and the way they're framing the issue, because the level of nuance they're using at the federal level, it's not the same, but it mirrors enough of our elements locally in a city like Detroit where we do have some optimism.
That's great. That's great. I mean, there was chatter here in DC and abroad, sort of the week leading up to it. There were, a couple of states that hadn't submitted their letters of intent yet, and we were wondering whether, politics would rule, or would states ultimately sign on and do what's in the best interest of their communities that are struggling, particularly in the pandemic with connectivity and digital equity. So it was good to see ultimately all of the 50 states sign on. I think you would agree. But what is Detroit doing to get the most of this funding, right? Given the realities of the IIJA, I know you're working on a municipal solution specifically as mandated by your citizens. But how do you manage that, and how are you interacting with the state of Michigan, which I know is still a little bit behind the 8 ball in terms of getting the broadband office set up and getting those strategies deployed and moving forward?
Yeah, so we've done this a number of ways, and as you mentioned, yeah, the state of Michigan has their work cut out for them, especially. And I'm not just going to say Ohio's doing a great job because I'm from there, I'm saying Ohio is doing a really great job on their broadband front. And I think that those pressures, as we look at what they're doing over there, Michigan's like, man, we can't lose Ohio here too. And so I think that, we have had some prolonged time of not having a functioning broadband office that was up and running. Connect Michigan was operating in the void of that office to the best of their ability. But, now we do have some folks who are working in that office. And to the point on the municipal strategy that we have, we, the city of Detroit, are going after deploying a open access network, and we're starting with a piloted neighborhood called Hope Village. It's roughly 2,200 homes. Our construction RFP is out; it's active right now, as well as our material RFP. So, that is good news for us that the momentum is there. It's not just a talking point. We want to approach these BEAD conversations with not we have a digital divide in Detroit that we can't solve. Rather, we have a scalable solution that if we had additional investment, we could scale it even faster, and we could bridge our digital divide that much faster too. And so the onus, or the way that we're framing this conversation is flipped. Historically, if you're in an urban community, you're going to reference your poverty rates or digital inequity rates. You're going to say, we need X amount of funding to be able to do this. Whereas now we're saying, no. We have a solution that came from residents that we can scale citywide with the appropriate investment. And I think that's the piece that we like. And quite frankly, at our last community meeting, because we've been doing several, I think we're on number 3 or 4 now of these public facing meetings, the state of Michigan was actually present there. And they said, hey, we love this approach. And we want to make sure that everyone knows that we are behind the way that Detroit is thinking about this. And that is a beautiful endorsement to receive from the state on something that many people look at as risky and politically risky at that. An open access network is one where, we're not picking winners. We believe in just laying down the infrastructure. We, the city, are not going to be a service provider on ours. We're going to have a private operator there. But at the end of the day, I think that because we're going against the grain and because we are the biggest city in this country attempting to do this, well, then that's going to naturally have its challenges. So it feels really great to be in lockstep on that regard with the state of Michigan.
Absolutely. That's a great approach. And I know, municipal ownership is sort of quasi controversial depending on where you are. But,
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about the background and why the city decided to pursue a municipal open access model instead of utilizing local incumbent carriers that clearly didn't take care of the needs of the citizens. Can you give us a brief overview of why the city chose this approach?
Yeah. So, I'll say my first 2 years in this city, hand in hand worked with the internet providers. I did. They supported our digital inclusion weeks. They supported sponsorship opportunities. They helped get kids internet, kids computers, all that stuff. We worked in tandem with them perfectly. And I would say that we still do to some extent, though, as we've gone down this open access pathway that has made the relationship more interesting than it was before. But that being said, the reason why we went down this route, it had nothing to do with we, the municipality, wanting to do this just for the sake of doing it, because quite frankly, it's made our work a lot harder. But there was a community, Hope Village, that I mentioned where we're doing the pilot. They had a prolonged internet outage last year. And by prolonged, I'm not talking about a couple of days. I'm talking about well over a month. No internet.
In the height of a pandemic.
Yes, in the height of a pandemic, no internet and no landline either. So both went down. And so as you think about emergency services or really anything, especially in a neighborhood that does have a pronounced poverty rate, that it just compounded the issue to the point that we, the municipality, had to do something. And so thankfully, we, out of Connect 3 and 3, we do have a whole structure where residents are able to submit feedback on things that we should be working on. And a resident actually submitted feedback and saying that we should consider doing an open access model. And I'm like, wow. But the fact that resident voice is actually driving this and we can just be supporting that, beautiful. And so we heard the open access call. We saw a way that we could respond to residents in need. And the best part about this trifecta was we had rescue plan funding. And I want to be very clear when we think about rescue plan funding. Yeah, that naming is very intentional. And so essentially, what are we saving people from this investment we're making here? Well, unreliable infrastructure that could go down for months at a time that we don't have an answer for because we have no ownership. Now that we have ownership in this equation, now that we are deploying fiber down there, we're going to be operating from a sense of urgency because these are our residents, not our customers. And so I think that distinction allows us to move in a way where we're being supportive and being responsive to our residents. But, we didn't want it to just be Hope Village. So we also did issue a citywide poll. We worked with the folks at GQR Consulting based in DC to do a political phone banking effort where they called over 600 Detroit residents. And what we were able to find is that 82% of Detroit residents say that cost is the biggest barrier for their internet and that they support a publicly funded infrastructure. And so I think that not only are we responsive to the immediate community in Hope Village, we're also responsive to the broader community that 8 out of 10 Detroiters are supporting this plan.
That's great. That's great. So, final question. That's great. So, final question in this segment. Let's talk about the city's additional approaches. So, will the city utilize any additional funding? You talked about ARPA money. You talked about some other sources. Outside of the IIJA, will the city utilize any alternative methods of funding to ensure, digital equity, infrastructure expansion for all of its residents?
Most definitely. So I think that that's definitely a tiered approach. And so the tiered approach corresponds to the tiered funding. So on the private and philanthropic side, we're still going to keep doing that work in partnership with the Rocket Community Fund, the Knight Foundation, and a number of other fantastic funders who have supported us, who recognize that digital equity is in their wheelhouse. And they see it as their responsibility too, a shared responsibility. So a lot of that work around our neighborhood technology hubs, our digital literacy curriculums, our instructors, any kind of community organizing, all of that work is still going to continue, and we are still going to be soliciting funding for those purposes. And obviously, the Digital Equity Act does support some of that framework too. And so we are going to be going after funding under the Digital Equity Act. On the BEAD side, absolutely, we're going to have a broadband ask out there. Obviously, we're not going to be able to ask for citywide because Detroit being 140 plus square miles, there's not enough funding in BEAD to even cover this. Now, BEAD specifically, yes, but not for us and everyone else. That being said, there's also been some CARES Act funding and ARPA funding that is sitting at the state right now to the tune of about $250 million that is also going to be used for broadband expansion. And so there are pools of funding that are being made available. Our job is to make sure that we are on top of those, that the LOIs are ready, and that our plans are solid, and that we have a mapped approach to say, our priority areas look like this and not this, and our priority areas cost this much. And so we're figuring out that stuff. We're working with the team of engineers to help us get that information shovel ready so that when these applications become open, we're not scrambling and trying to pack this all up at once. We have a very informative way that we're going to be doing this. The only last thing I'll say on this front, as we're looking at additional funding, is that whenever people look at especially these other cities. This is more so a shout out to the other cities who want to go down this pathway and are scared of the sticker price. And they're saying, well, this network's going to cost $1 billion for us to build. And it's like, yeah. And your house probably costs north of $250,000 to buy, but you didn't put down $250,000 for it. You put down a down payment. And so I think that what we're doing right now is a down payment on a revenue generating asset. And so anything that helps us make that down payment more clear, that's what we're working towards. We're not asking for 100% off the gate. I don't think any city is. But as long as that thinking is in place, that this is an infrastructure that can scale over time, then that's okay with us. And that's exactly how we're working on this.
Great. Thank you. I mean, that's a great honesty there. And that leads me into my next segment of questions that I want to talk to you about. And you had mentioned the sheer miles of Detroit and the number of people, right, in an urban environment. That leads into this sort of urban and rural dynamic that's percolating under the IIJA broadband programs at NTIA. I'm going to read here, a producer provided me with this. Recently, there was an article in the Harvard Business Review. Matter of fact, it was just produced this month. And the article is entitled, How Biden's Internet for All initiative Can Actually Fulfill Its Mission. And it discussed how the NTIA-B program essentially prioritizes miles, the deployment of infrastructure, over actual people. And the unfortunate reality that the article talked about is that the issue of individuals or people impacted or affected is actually larger or wider in urban areas, 3 times as many urban households as rural households that actually live without a broadband subscription. The article goes on and states that while $65 billion allocated under the broadband programs is a large sum, it's still short of what's needed to close all of the gaps completely across all of our communities, both rural and urban. But the article really talked about a key point that I want to talk to you about. And it states that the funding is disproportionately allocated to building out fiber infrastructure in rural areas as preferred by NTIA. It severely reduces the budget for expanding infrastructure and affordable access in urban areas. And the author actually referenced data that they found that approximately 73% of the funding is likely to be aimed at increasing access in rural areas, while only 21% will address the affordability challenge, mostly in urban areas. So now that leads me to my question with you, Josh. In the past, you have spoken openly and often thoughtfully and critically, not negatively, but critically, about the amount of total funding that's needed to address these issues. And now we have data estimates from this article and study that justifies that. So, what are your thoughts on that in terms of the $65 billion not being enough, but also this percolating divide between rural areas and the needs of our urban communities?
So, yes, I have definitely been very public about how I felt about the number, and I think it's twofold because again, I've seen the reality when this funding wasn't available. And so it's not like this is a thing where I'm sad or I'm angry. I'm thankful that the leadership has got us here. I think that what I usually have an issue of is the broader talking point around this funding, as if it's enough. And when you double click or triple click to the ground here, we're sitting there thinking, we're not even going to get everything that we want to be at 100% in the city of Detroit. So we know across the board that's not going to be the case. But again, as we hear the national folks talking about it, high fiving and everything and saying we got it solved, we hear locally, we just put fiber in, or we're putting fiber in Hope Village. I now have to defend why we didn't do that on the east side. And it's like, I had to keep telling people it's not enough money. And so I think the equivalent is, you have a buffet that, can feed a couple 100,000, but it can't feed a million. And so I think that's the issue here. But again, I don't have an issue with the money that's there. I'm thankful. I think anything more of this would have actually led to greater political gridlock. I don't think that the amount that was actually needed. I don't think that would have been approved. I think that we need to be thinking incrementally here. I think the onus rests on local communities being organized. We have to be organized. We need to make everyone else make a tough decision. We don't need to make the tough decision of not being organized. We don't need to make the tough decision on not having enough resources. We need to make the tough decision on saying, let us organize our community effectively and make sure that the state or make sure the folks at NTIA or anyone else who is allocating this funding has to say, dang, that's hard. That's hard. I want someone else to make that decision. So yeah, we aren't too thrilled with the greater and broader talking points, but we have a responsibility. And I think that responsibility is going to shine very clear as to how well we're organized, how well we're able to challenge during that challenge process, and quite frankly, how many people in our local communities, specifically in Detroit but across the country, are even aware that this is happening. And so I think that there's a lot of competing interests here. And I think there's a lot of political risk. And I think that the mayors and city leaders who are able to look at a project like Hope Village and be inspired by that and say, we want more of that, those are going to be the folks who get a greater lion's share of the funding. And the other folks who look at that and saying that's politically risky, we're not going to do it, we're going to do some other variant of whatever you're trying to do, which I'm not going to disparage any technology other than fiber. I'm just going to say fiber is what we're doing. That's going to reveal itself too. But again, I just think that the onus really still falls on local communities, making sure that our voices are heard, making sure that we're organized, making sure that we're doing this in a transparent and public way, that anyone knows that this is what we're doing. And there's no doubt on anyone's mind that, oh, is Detroit doing open access? You betcha. We said it here on this podcast, and I said it on every single other podcast and panel I've been on since the beginning of the year.
Yeah, that's been about 2 million of them, by the way. So that leads me to our next issue. And again, I'm going to read from another study. As you know, one of the stated goals of the Biden administration's Internet for All initiative is to close these gaps, these digital divide gaps, specifically in communities of color. However, a recent study conducted by the Fletcher School at Tufts University called Imagining a Digital Economy for All, IDEA 2030, states that the potential for racial injustice associated with the potential misallocation of BEAD funding is indeed significant. The study finds that the 10 largest cities in the US, primarily lower income, majority non white zip codes, would generally be assigned lower priority because they would be classified as underserved, not unserved. And then nationwide, approximately 16.5 million of the 66.4 million Americans who cannot reasonably afford the cheapest internet only plan in their zip code are African American or Black. And many of these people, the study states, are poised to be left behind. So, in addition to what you talked about, this growing tension or competition between fiber providers and wireless providers, and now we're talking about urban areas versus rural areas in pursuit of these historic funds. What's your opinion from an urban and a city perspective regarding this growing sort of tension or underlying competition in pursuit of these funds?
So, I think that more than anything, there might be, not even might be, there's a misalignment on like priorities, stated goals, and legitimate outcomes that can happen here. I think that, us doing open access, the reason why we're going down this pathway is because we've seen, for example, the city that we're most motivated by in an open access capacity, the city of Ammon, Idaho.
Mm-hmm.
What Ammon and Detroit have in common? Maybe a vowel in the name. That's about it. But there is something to be said about them having internet providers in that area who are offering service fees at $10 a month for gigabit speed internet. I mean, those are the things that, as we think about this, whatever funding that's going out the door now, I don't think people are looking at the digital divide as a paradigm, and a cyclical one at that. All these things that we're talking about as we look at underconnectivity, especially in these urban areas and even in the rural areas, underconnectivity and correlating that with poverty. It's like, guys, if you have a solution for poverty, now's the time to raise your hand for it. And if you don't have a solution for poverty, which no one really does, then it's like, what symptom of the digital divide can we at least eradicate out of the cyclical nature of poverty? In this case, the cost of service. So what investments are being made that is going to make service costs cheaper in the long run? And not service costs has to be dependent on a subsidy. The chairwoman, Jessica Rosenworcel, also actually visited us in Detroit alongside our lieutenant governor and Congresswoman Tlaib and Congresswoman Lawrence. And it was a fantastic roundtable that we had. And one of the points I said to her that I'll say here too is that the subsidies are great. I'm not happy that the subsidy argument is then being boiled down to an affordability argument for the low income areas. When it's like, no. It is still an infrastructure issue. Yes, the infrastructure is unaffordable at times for many, but that doesn't make it an affordability issue. That means by the very nature of the infrastructure that we have set up now, it is not affordable and it's not serving the needs of Detroiters or any other city across the board. It's serving the needs of many, but not all of them. And in the areas that we're seeing in Detroit, we reference Hope Village for having that prolonged internet outage. They weren't the only one last year. As it turns out, there were 3 other areas that had over a month internet outages in the city of Detroit. So our infrastructure isn't as reliable as it's painted, despite that's what people say it is. It's not. In addition to that, people can't afford it. So I think that more than anything, funding really needs to go to whether you're in rural or urban. I don't even care at this point. Funding at this point needs to go to infrastructures that are going to yield lower costs and are more reliable. If they are not that, we do not need to be funding them. And I think that's the part where we look at our current price for service in these communities. If I'm averaging $70 a month for a quality plan, I don't even count those other $10 a month plans because a lot of times it's not enough bandwidth for these families. And so these $70 a month plans, they're not enough. And unfortunately, the minute we try and step outside and do any municipal ownership or an open access model, people get their hands slapped so hard they never want to raise it again to do anything else. And so in Detroit, we are hoping and praying that this can create the necessary groundswell that changes the way that people think about infrastructure, whether it be rural or urban. I think that our end goal here, especially in Detroit, we want a more connected Michigan. But Detroit is the biggest city in Michigan. And so if you have your largest city that is now setting a standard for what connectivity looks like, you then can work backwards opposed to saying, let's go everywhere else and then come to them last. So we are still going to be making our case on that organized part. But I would say that anyone who has any gripe against the way that this funding is being allocated better be pointing to a better solution than what's out there, opposed to just the griping of this funding isn't going to where we want it to go.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that brings to mind for me a story. One of my last speaking engagements at NTIA, I was in rural Alabama, followed by New York City. And I heard the same exact themes in rural Alabama that I heard in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, 2 minutes away from the Barclays Center. We were hearing the same themes, right? Right. Yeah. I don't know who my provider is. If I do know, they suck. And whatever I'm getting is not good enough. So whether we claim, we know anecdotally that, there are pockets of broadband deserts in urban areas. We know in rural areas that, we need broadband expansion. What I particularly don't like is this, underbidding and this competition, undergirding competition between, rural areas, which in the past have been code for majority white areas or non-Black or persons of color areas, with urban areas where it's just being an affordability issue. And that's really more towards poverty and people of color. My experience has been totally different. It's that people who don't have internet in rural areas, poor, Black, white, whatever, they need it. People who don't have internet in urban areas, poor, Black, white, whatever, they need it. The common denominator has been the economics behind it, the challenge behind when we talk about poverty and talking about addressing quality of life issues and quality of service issues. So I'm excited about hopefully this money, this funding, these strategies, really eradicating one of the indicators of poverty. And if we can normalize that and make quality broadband access available, perhaps it can be a foundation for entrepreneurs or entrepreneurship, for STEM and STEM and other types of STEAM developments that goes at the heart of generating economic security, for our communities, both in rural areas as well as in urban areas. And it is fun. It's funny. We look at the screen right now. I use our state of the art broadband .money tool to bring up, and you can see here the picture of Detroit, and you can see just from the algorithm that's running here, you can see that there pockets of unserved and underserved. And I welcome you all to join the Broadband.money platform to figure out what's going on in your area. But you can see clearly right here, as Josh was talking about, there are pockets of unserved and underserved communities in the heart of the city of Detroit, Motor City, USA. Way into a couple more segments here on who you are. Who is Joshua Edmonds, right? I want to turn this focus to you because I've known you for a while. We've been on the broadband speaking circuit together. You've been a celebrity, if not a rock star, on the broadband and digital equity circuit, now for a while. If you had a TV show, it would be entitled "Everybody Loves Josh." So with that, what drives you? How did you get into this work, and what's next for you?
So I I think what drives me, I think that answer changes all the time, but it's strategy. I don't know why, but like the ability, strategy, it's always been a thing for me. I always tease that I'm the youngest of three, and my dad taught me how to play chess. Didn't really teach my brother and sister because he's like they don't appreciate strategy. And so strategy has always been a thing for me. And so I would like to give a fluffier answer about equity and changing outcomes. I'm like, yeah, no, that's there. Like I care about this stuff. I mean, I won't sugarcoat it. Detroit is the blackest city in the country, and I'm a graduate of Howard University, and so I mean, there is definitely a correlation there where I want to see this community succeed at all odds. In addition to that, though, strategy and being able to create something and to be able to get people to see the power of that and then it getting success and changing lives, I mean, that's a beautiful thing. And so I think that's more so that part. And I think what really got me into this work, I think this work has always been present, whether I want to admit it or not. I think it always has been. I've always kind of loved technology for some reason. I remember I also did a stint working Best Buy tech support, and I was answering phone calls when I was in college from just seniors who were getting their information stolen, or they come in saying, I gave you my information about a $500 gift card for Best Buy, and I didn't see anything. And so I'm like, oh my
You
gosh.
were you
So
were
like,
part of the geek squad, huh?
yeah, I did not know at the time that that was, my intersection with digital literacy.
Mhm.
I obviously on my family front, definitely try and get them as engaged as possible. I remember when I was able to get my Grammy Netflix and get her first Netflix subscription and walking her through that. It was so exciting to see her face light up. And so, like, I think that for me, a lot of this work has always been present. I just never really put anything to it. And then it didn't come until I started seeing opportunities for it. I'm like, oh, I could do that. I'd like to do that. And then all of a sudden I'm here today saying, oh my gosh, that all made sense. But at the time, it wasn't like that, obviously.
Well, like I said, you're definitely a celebrity and a rock star. You speak everywhere. You're on every panel. You just did a movie commercial. Like, you're like the creme de la creme in digital equity and broadband. So what's your typical day like? What does your typical day consist of?
So now I'm thankful I do have a wonderful team now. So no longer running the solo shop. So we do have a newer CIO who has succeeded, Beth Niblock, who brought me to Detroit. She's also the CIO for HUD now. But our new CIO, he's phenomenal. We get to work with him. That's Art Thompson. Now I also have a deputy director, Autumn Evans, who is a fantastic community person who also serves as our operations director for Connect 3 and 3. And we were able to hire our first digital equity manager now, Oscar Chapo from Southwest Detroit. And so, whereas before my role looked more like a independent consultant, now I actually have to do the team stuff. I'm like, oh my gosh, like team building meetings, like now getting people to say, you go over here, you go over here, you go, and directing. I mean, a lot of our conversations are now still on the infrastructure front, making sure our RFPs are out the door, making sure all of our ARPA money, we did get $41 million allocated for digital inclusion. So getting all that money out the door, going through city council processes, while at the same time reading through that Bible of Anofo that came out. In addition to that, it's a series of community meetings, from the Affordable Connectivity Program support. We were one of those cities that were over 95,000 households enrolled in that program. So we've taken that stuff seriously, but a lot of it is just organizing, strategy, in addition to all those other things I just named.
Yeah, no, the analogy I take from that is you're doing chess, not checkers, right? Right. All right. All right.
Absolutely.
So since your time in Detroit, can you give me and my audience a funny experience or funny story that you would love to share? This is a podcast. It can be PG, R. I don't want to go too much further than that. But,
So,
funny story. And I say this because I know Detroit. I'm from Detroit, born and raised. Detroit versus everybody. I get it. But if you have a funny story you were willing to share, and keep in mind that kids may be watching.
all right, all right. So I'll reference one and give you the real one.
All right, there we go.
So one, when I first moved to Detroit, I moved to an area called Dexter Davison. I didn't know that Dexter Davison was Dexter Davison. And when I got over there, it was the wintertime and it was quiet. And then when the summertime came around, I said, oh, I know where I am. And you're nodding your head because you know that area.
I
And
know
so when I tell that story to Detroiters, they're like, you're over there and you're a director? So, but one of what happened recently, I was actually at a community meeting and there was media there. And there was this pretty news anchor. And I was just like, oh, as long as she doesn't interview me, I'm fine. And the next thing I know, they're like, Josh, they would like to do an interview with you. And I'm like, okay. Thought she was an assistant. And then it said, okay, you'll be interviewing with her. And I'm like, oh, come on. Instantly, I started sweating. I don't know why, she's just really pretty. And like, we were making eye contact. And like, she asked me, why are you guys doing open access? I'm sweating at this point at the camera, and this is live. And I start talking about customer service and all these other things. I didn't know what I was doing because it was so pretty. And afterwards, I did circle back with her. And I just asked, I had to make it known my look. That's why I was sweating. She said, yeah, my producer said, was it hot in there? And she's like, no, I think that he was sweating for a different reason. And so everyone who saw the interview was like, man, were you okay? What happened? I'm like, you all don't know. That woman was really pretty. And so that's where that came from.
God, that's great. That's great. Yeah, nothing like being on live camera, right? you can't,
Yeah.
and you can't get your thoughts together, and being distracted. That's a problem. A couple more personal questions here. So, giving the audience a view about your background, your upbringing. I know you went to Notre Dame College, Howard University. You've done all these other great things, all these other great accolades. You actually are a track athlete. So, can you give me an analogy of how that competitive spirit, that track experience, has transitioned or impacted you in your work now, professionally? How have you made? What are lessons that you've learned from being and I want to say former track athlete? I'm assuming you're not running any 400s and 800s these days.
Well, so this all goes back to that strategy point. Let me give you one quick example from track that works. I remember for districts, this was in high school. We were running, and there was a team that was faster than my team. So I ran, the 800 as well as a 4x800 meter relay, and I would anchor that. And they had this one guy who I was anchoring against who was faster than me. And I remember I was able to beat him because I was watching the shadow as we are running. He was behind me, and I could see the shadow where he was. So if he was bigger, he was obviously closer. He was, smaller, further away. And I was running and blocking him from passing me. And I forced him to run in lane 2 for pretty much 2 laps and was able to hold him off and beat him that way. And I think that's the piece where the strategy was bleeding through, where like more than anything, that same type of strategy I was using then, I still use now. And so at some point when I publish some type of book or memoir about all the experiences in Detroit, I have used that same brain to accomplish a lot of objectives. And I can't say them now because someone's going to feel like, oh, he got me. He got me. So I can't say it now. But the minute I'm in a different role, I will tell you exactly how I was able to use some sundial positioning to actually get some things accomplished in Detroit.
That's a great analogy. Thank you for sharing. So let's go to closing. Again, Josh, I want to thank you for being a part of this inaugural episode number 1. I was in with a story. And so Josh and I recently, we were at Mountain Connect, which was this big sort of kind of post-pandemic broadband conference out in Keystone, Colorado. This was mid-May, right?
Yeah.
A couple weeks before, week or so before Memorial Day. And of course, they put the digital equity panel, the last panel of the actual damn conference before everybody left. But that's okay. We're talking about that. We're going to leave that one there. And it was really lively discussion. And so afterwards, the cameraman who was filming us, he came up to me and was like, "Oh my God, you and Josh, you guys were stars. You were like the absolute, best that I've ever seen. And I've been doing this for a while. You guys should run for president." I think, Josh, I told you this story. I said, y'all should run for office. And I turned to him. I was like, "That's a really good idea. I wonder who would be at the top of the ticket and who would be vice president." So Josh, we'll turn to you. If we were on the proverbial ticket, who would be president and who would be vice president?
Well, I'm not old enough, so you.
Okay. Well, we'll take age over beauty or beauty over age. I'll take that. Uh, Oh, that's funny. But no, I've known Josh for a while. He is indeed a star, and I mean that. I mean that he believes in what he's doing. He's fighting for the people of the city of Detroit, as well as for digital equity and inclusion and access, and for broadband expansion for everyone around the country, not just city of Detroit, but his focus is on the city of Detroit. And so, Josh, I want to thank you for being my first guest. I want to thank you for joining us today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And special thanks to Josh Edmonds for his guest appearance. Please feel free to join and follow me on Twitter, no trolls. You can follow me at sdwoods-esq, also on LinkedIn, and of course on our Broadband.money platform. Ready or Not with Scott Woods is brought to you by Ready.net and Broadband.money, the fastest way to win broadband grants for your community. To access key information, including modules, tools, lessons, and guides that will assist you in the application process, or to learn more information, or to sign up for open enrollment, please visit us at Broadband.money. Please join me again for episode number 2 of Ready or Not with Scott D. Woods next month for another special guest and a lively discussion. Until then, be well and Godspeed.